Ready? Good. Okay. Hello everyone, Tom at Snake River Base again. I wanted to talk a little bit about fabric and also about what that means for pilot chute construction. I saw a couple of people on the internet who didn't really get the difference between block and bias of the material, and so I wanted to shoot some videos and talk about that. Talk about where the block is, where the bias is, what the stretch direction is, and what kind of things you should look for on a pilot chute in terms of blocking out the bias with reinforcing tapes. All right, so hopefully you've got a pilot chute in your hands as you watch this video. And I want to talk a little bit about the characteristics of the fabric here and what kind of things you want to look for in terms of how the pilot chute's constructed. First thing I want you to do is look carefully at the material of your pilot chute. It's going to be really hard to see this in this video, but there's a little grid in the fabric. It's a whole bunch of squares like this, okay? The grid does some interesting things to the characteristics of the fabric. If I put my hands on the fabric and I pull in this direction, in line with those blocks, we'll discover that the fabric doesn't really stretch very much. I've cut this piece so that this straight line here is right in line with what we call the block of the material. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to line it up here, and we can see that this is a 12-inch piece of material. When I pull on it, it's pretty much still a 12-inch piece of material. There's almost no stretch there. But now I'm going to do something else. I'm going to put my hands this way. I'm going to pull at a 45-degree angle to the squares in the material. This is a direction that we call the bias of the material. And you can see I've cut this along the bias. So if I put my hands the same 12 inches, that's 1 foot apart, for those of you who live in technologically challenged countries that use that, what's called the metric system. So I'm going to put my fingers about 12 inches apart and pull. And you can see this time, I end up with more than 14 inches of fabric between my hands. So there's a substantial difference in stretch. If I pull along the block direction, the fabric really doesn't stretch at all. If I pull in the bias direction, the fabric stretches a lot. So what does that mean for us when we're looking at a pilot chute? Well, here I've got a pilot chute, which is a 32-inch pilot chute. And if I lay it out, it doesn't really matter, but you can see that it's a 32 if I were to measure it from an even number of feet. But if I pull this pilot chute, again in both directions, I can see the pilot chute stretches very asymmetrically as well. So here, in the block direction, almost no stretch. But if I shift my hands and I pull in the bias direction along the 45 of the fabric, you can see, where's the bias of that? You can see that in this direction I've got a lot of stretch. This 32 stretches probably 5 or 6 inches, which means in one direction it's a 32, and in the other direction it's more like a 38, 39, 40, something like that. That's going to make it radically asymmetric during inflation. This is obviously an old pilot chute. We very rarely see them like this. What does a modern pilot chute look like on the top? Take a look at your pilot chute. You're holding it in your hands right now, right? And you'll see that a modern pilot chute has reinforcement tapes. On a modern pilot chute, if I pull in the bias direction, or in the block direction, the fabric is strong, doesn't stretch. And if I pull in the bias direction, the reinforcing tape prevents the fabric from stretching. That's the real purpose of these reinforcing tapes on the top skin. It prevents the fabric from stretching in the bias direction. But it's important that you know where the block and bias are so you can identify that the tapes have been placed correctly by whoever manufactured your pilot chute. Here are a couple of pilot chutes which look very similar to each other, right? This is a 32, this is a 32. This one's got a couple more tapes. We'll talk about that in a later video and why they did that. But you can see on this one, it seems like I've got good tapes. Here, if I identify the bias direction, I pull on it. Down this tape, pilot chute is reinforced well. But on this one, if I identify the bias direction and pull on it, there's still all kinds of stretch because whoever built this pilot chute ran these tapes down the block instead of the bias. What does that mean for you? It means look at your pilot chute, you're holding in your hands right now, I hope, and make sure that you've got tapes running down the block and you're not being fooled with a pilot chute that really does stretch dramatically in the bias direction.